thank you so much for coming this evening. Thank you for having me, Ali.
Oh, thank you for being here, and thank you to everyone who's here. It's always surreal when you write something and people actually want to read it still. So
It is kind of weird now. It's a great feeling still.
yeah, for it to finally be in the world.
Yeah. Before we start, I want to sort of give you the opportunity to do the quick elevator pitch about what the book's about, because we're going to talk a little bit more broadly about things as opposed to sort of the nitty-gritty so that we don't give anything away.
Sure. Well, in the early days of the Troubles, which is how the sectarian conflict that racked Northern Ireland from 1970 to the 1990s is referred, the Provisional IRA received an influx of high-powered weaponry. And what a lot of people don't know is that a lot of those guns came from America. And this book just details kind of one specific storyline of how a lot of those guns got there, and it focuses specifically on a group of men in Philadelphia who kind of quietly sent the IRA its first huge haul of American Armalites and changed the course of history in doing so.
And in reading the epilogue, you came to this story in a very personal way. Can you talk a little bit about that, like your family history?
Yeah. I mean, it's a story that a lot of second and third generation Irish Americans sort of have in their history. There's these kind of shadowy beginnings of uncles and grandfathers and great grandfathers who sort of showed up under auspicious circumstances that no one quite knows how or why, and then generations down, nobody really wants to talk about it. This book is dedicated to my late grandmother, who would probably hate the fact that it's written. There had always been this kind of rumor about my own great-grandfather who had landed in Philadelphia in a heavily Irish neighborhood, and there were all these questions about how he wound up there and why he had left. He was actually part of an IRB unit in Liverpool in the 20s. And so, as a great-granddaughter, I was always kind of fascinated by this story, and a couple cousins and I sort of became obsessed with it through the years. But unfortunately, along with being a great-granddaughter, I'm also an investigative journalist, so it didn't stay gray for very long. And during the coronavirus pandemic, I just had some extra time and started to really dig a little more into this story with the help of my mom and some other relatives. And we were kind of able to find some documents in Ireland. This is one of those classic reporting rabbit holes that, I'm kind of pursuing personally. And I vividly remember sitting at this Manhattan bagel shop, just kind of Googling around for, Irish Philadelphia stuff and kind of trying to understand more about why my great-grandfather landed there. And this article popped up that said, 5 indicted in Ulster gun running in Philadelphia. And I was like, that is a hell of a headline, and I have never heard this story before. From there, it kind of spooled out. So, it was cool. It had a really personal entry point for me, but it so quickly became about this community in Philadelphia, and then, it spreads across a lot of different Irish American strongholds. So,
Yeah, speaking of that, what made Philly, because broadly speaking, I live in Philly. I live in an Irish neighborhood in Philadelphia, so I think of Philly as a very Irish city. But most Americans their mind first goes to Boston or New York or Chicago. So what was it about Philadelphia specifically that made it such sort of a fertile area for this kind of activity?
Yeah, something that I don't think really appreciated until I started digging into this is that by nature of chain migration, it's not just that American cities became Irish or fostered Irish diasporas. It's that certain American cities fostered diasporas from very specific counties. And, Boston got, people from the West and often people from Belfast, and New York, the South Bronx tended to get people kind of a mix from a lot of different places. And Philadelphia got a lot of people from the North. And it's quite interesting, even now, when you're over in Ireland and you tell people you're from Philadelphia, a lot of people are like, oh, it's a Tyrone town. Or there's a lot of people from Derry who wound up in Ireland and Donegal, just by the nature of shipping routes. So I think that was something that really made the Philly diaspora different, is that you had this history of people coming to the city, not just from Ireland, even when it was still under British rule entirely, but specifically in that post 1920s, post Irish War of Independence and partition, you had a lot of people from those northern counties wind up in Philadelphia, and it creates this kind of cloistered community. And there's also something, I think, a little less tangible about Philly that, compared to some other cities, Philly is, I don't know how to describe this without profanity, because they even use it in the song, for God's sake. Philly just doesn't really care. And they are going to protect their own and be incredibly defensive of themselves. And I think there's a certain level of that spirit that gets fostered in any community that lands in Philly. You sort of absorb that. So,
yeah, and I think that for me, one thing that stuck out a lot in your book was that when, during the 70s, which is when much of the book takes place, is that this support of the cause in Ireland sort of brought the Philadelphia Irish community together in a much stronger way than it had been before.
Yeah, absolutely. And that tradition was in Philadelphia even before the Troubles began, and it started, you saw a lot of, even in the Fenian movement in the late 1800s, a lot of that kind of was fostered in the South Bronx and in New York. But we start seeing in the 1920s, a lot of that spirit kind of starts moving to Philadelphia, where you had this group called Clan de Gael, which is talked about a lot in the book, which was kind of this, it became this sort of repository club for veterans of the IRA when they came to America. And that kind of winds up being loosely based in Philadelphia. And you start seeing these sort of secret organizations or very cloistered societies of people land in Philly around that time. So that tradition, the reason I think Philadelphia fell so quickly in line in the 1970s is because it had been there for a long time,
So, this book is about the Troubles, and a lot of the Troubles revolve around some level of violence. How do you, as the writer of the book, sort of figure out how to balance the morality of the broader struggle with individual acts of violence?
This was really, really hard. And I think, one of the reasons that I'm so glad that the book landed with Little Brown is because, I was looking for editing that understood the sensitivities of this. Because, there is a sort of stereotype in Irish America that I think to some degree can be true, that there's a sort of romanticism sometimes with the Troubles. That doesn't mean that's not a broad brush. Obviously, no group is a monolith, but I was really cognizant of that going into this book, that we didn't want to kind of create a romanticized version of conflict. At the same time, we didn't want to dismiss the very legitimate reasons that people felt the need to behave, act this way and to engage in armed struggle. So I think I've covered security and violence and conflict in some degree, sometimes macro scale, sometimes micro, for most of my career. And something that I think is really important when we talk about violence is it's a gun and person at either end of it, and I think it can be very hard to wrap our arms around these very heady, geopolitical, moral issues. But if we kind of narrow it down to these small instances, and we talk about there's one person on this side of the gun, there's one person on that side of the gun, how on earth did either side get here? I think that just becomes a lot more tangible, and it lets us talk about conflict in a much more nuanced, realistic way. And that was really important to me in this book, to tell both sides of that.
Yeah, I think that comes through really well in the book. So good job for you and your editor. But
I'll take that to the bank.
I also think it's interesting thinking about the individual struggles that certain characters in the book go through in terms of their morals, and then broadly speaking, what the Irish American community is going through in terms of where they think their money is going, why they're donating it, and the cause they're actually donating it to. And in reading that, I think that there is sort of an inherent tension in the book between Americanness and Irishness. And I guess this is really bad as a journalist. I don't really have a question about that, but I think that it's something that I noticed that I really appreciated and hadn't really thought about before, about how there's people that are from Ireland that live in America in this book, and people that go back to Ireland. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how they view themselves as either naturalized Americans or folks that are going back to Ireland for the struggle.
Yeah, it's a really, I find it to be the most compelling kind of quandary at the heart of this book is like, and I think I even mentioned it in a piece I wrote for the Inquirer, of like these characters are kind of constantly wrestling with this question: am I Irish or am I American? And can I be both? And how can I be both if both of these identities are suddenly against each other, you know? Because there's a lot of struggles among the Irish Americans in this book who don't understand why the American legal system is not on their side, or don't understand how the country they've come to love as their adopted home is not supporting the country they left. And I think that's like, that is kind of the heart of all of our conversations about immigration at some level, right? Of like, when do you become American, and when do you leave behind the place that you left? It's been kind of a weird conversation for me too, because I have emigrated now. You know, I grew up Irish American in an American house, and now I'm the American in Ireland. It's just kind of this, you know, where do you belong and how do you exercise? You know, in some ways I feel further from my Irish heritage there than I did here, because suddenly you're being faced with the fact that like, oh no, your version of Irishness, or what you thought was Irish American, is actually like, I don't know, 50 years outdated, and no, we don't all drive carts around and drink Guinness at 2 p.m.
Yeah, I remember my wife's name is Colleen, and I remember she said the first time that she went to Ireland, she was like, oh, she expected people, and then they're like, we've never heard that name before in my life. Like
yeah, I named my dog Kellen over here, thinking that everyone would get it, and the number of times they're like, what? Keelan? You know, so, but it's kind of that you're confronted with these things and you realize how messy these identities are, you know?
Yeah. I think that sort of inherent tension between Americanness and Irishness, I also noticed the American government in this book is kind of in a pickle.
Yeah.
And that to me was not something I had really thought about beforehand, in terms of how they need to play both, you know, they're an international hegemon, and then they also have to worry about Irish American voters.
Yeah. There is this kind of like almost dopey element to, you know, the American government kind of trying to bumble its way through, no, we don't want to see this. This is not our problem. Shit, it's kind of our problem. But we really still don't want anything to do with it. But, you know, there's this kind of tension of how much one gets involved with something happening overseas, and how is that going to impact things at home. And yeah, I mean, there is, you know, and we saw that play out for decades through the Troubles of, you know, at the time, I think Irish America was a much more conglomerate voting bloc, and that did put the government in a really difficult situation of like they both risked alienating one of their most powerful allies in Europe, obviously the special relationship between them and the UK, and also this very clearly engaged Irish American contingent. And you know, it did get quite messy across the years. And then, of course, we see in the 90s, they sort of become the key arbiters at the end of all of this anyway. So it's a strange trip that America's taken on this subject.
One thing, you know, the main characters in the Philly Five are all men. And then at the beginning of the book, and then later in the book, you introduce female characters in a way that creates sort of a tension between those two groups. And I think that the gender dynamic of the provost is really interesting, and how that sort of shifted over the course of the Troubles.
Yeah. It was really important to me to find a woman character, because I think Irish America in general kind of has this macho element to it. But the whole concept of the IRA and the Troubles also has this sort of machismo, and just any guerrilla war has that machismo. And if women are talked about, it's often in this very kind of sexualized or stereotypical.
Or they're making dinner or whatever
yes.
for,
yeah,
you know,
exactly.
for these
or
hungry
like,
boys coming home.
Or for the bake sale or something, you know. And I'm actually really glad you noted that dichotomy, because there's been a couple things mentioned about the book that some people found it jarring and didn't necessarily go with the flow of the book, and I was like, that was kind of the point. But it's so important to recognize that. You know, some of the dichotomy here was that you had, generations of older Irish men in America, and then you had a 17-year-old girl with this gun she'd never touched before getting shot in Belfast. And, and that dichotomy was just so important to me to explain, and to also talk about women volunteers, soldiers, fighters, however you'd like to refer to them, outside of the kind of Price sister dynamic, which is obviously is done so well in Say Nothing, but across the course of history, they've sort of been this touchstone of these enigmatic Irish women rebels, and it's like there's actually a lot of regular people here who weren't these supercharged personalities. War at the end of the day involves mostly ordinary people, and I just think we need to be a lot more cognizant of that.
I want to talk a little bit about structure, which we just talked a little bit about. Structure in the book. In the end, this book kind of traces one gun through this entire struggle. And the reporting to get to that must have been really difficult. And what was that legwork like? And, where did it take you?
I don't know if any of you have ever tried to run through a brick wall, but it was basically that in 3 different countries for a while. And it was also a really big learning curve coming in as an American journalist who, I will complain for the day is long about transparency and American, agencies and whatever. And then you get to some place that, is not even interested in your FOIA and will never respond to you. And, that was a real wake-up call for me of just like how much harder it is to do reporting in some of these spaces where transparency isn't necessarily a shared value. So just the very basic logistics of this, I walked into the Philly courthouse with 2 banker's boxes of transcripts, thousands of pages, and was just like, well, I'm just going to page through this until they give me a really nice police report vignette of, man X sent this gun and it did Y in Belfast. Great, that's the book. I can figure that out. And then I found out that none of the serial numbers were in the documents. Not only that, they never even let the documents be introduced into court. And the British and Northern Irish officials had absolutely zero interest in engaging with me on the case. So it became this kind of constant cat and mouse game of every document, and it's reporters love telling these stories. They're kind of our like braggy graphs that.
That's why I asked.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate this softball thrown over the plate. But long story short, I found one line on one page of a transcript in a federal court document that, thank God to whatever clerk forgot to redact it, had like the date of an incident. It's actually in a sidebar conversation. So, this isn't public, and the judge is talking directly to the lawyers about evidence that he's not going to allow to be introduced in court. And he says, well, what's this incident with an Ann McCotter on this date? And it's like, once you have a name and a date, I'm cruising, So, that actually, Ann McCotter was unfortunately dead, but when you looked up her, some of the stuff about her, you realized she was actually charged with another woman who was named Geraldine Crawford. And, but again, these are where you find these kind of barriers. There's a real tendency in Irish America and just kind of America in general. The troubles feel very far away, and I'm very much guilty of that. It feels like a conflict that is 50 years old and didn't actually continue into the 90s and early 2000s. And then you get over there and you realize, like, actually, this is very much a living history. This wound is still very raw. And when you go over there and say, I'd like to talk to somebody about a gun in 1973, they're like, yep, sorry. Even that wasn't very helpful over there. It took a lot of knocking on doors, a lot of kind of digging through paperwork and piecing things together.
You took 2 of my questions with your answer, which I'm okay with. And partially, though, I think whenever, as journalists, we go into a community that's not necessarily ours, how do you establish trust, especially in a community like this, where literally the tagline is "Say Nothing"?
It was so difficult, and it's still really difficult. I mean, there's still a part of me, like, this book is coming out in the States, obviously. The book comes out in the UK and Ireland in 2 days. And it's a very different experience preparing for it to come out there than it is for it to come out here. I think in a lot of ways I'm almost more nervous for over there, because I think one of the real challenges with journalism these days is that we just don't have time anymore. And so much about building trust in communities is not about just showing up there and asking questions. It's about genuinely spending time with people whose experience you don't understand and getting to know them, and not just in the context of the story, but getting to know their lives and their experience. And I was so lucky to have the opportunity I went there initially on a fellowship to get a master's degree. And that just bought me time, and it gave me time to go up north and to sit in their pubs and to meet their families, and not quiz them out of the gate on the most traumatic moment of their lives. And, and also, there's a stereotype with journalists too that we won't stop asking questions and that we can be really disrespectful and mean and insensitive. And there is always a degree of that when you're dealing with certain events. But like knowing when like you've pushed enough and you actually don't have a right to everyone's trauma, and like if someone says, I actually don't want to talk about this with you, understanding that you need to respect that. And I think reporting up north just really, really taught me that. And I do feel really proud of the way we kind of handled ourselves and reported up there.
Yeah, I think, there's a part towards the end of the book where you talk a little bit about that, you catching yourself and you saying like, this isn't my story. I don't have to force this person to sort of go through this trauma again. And I thought personally, it was enlightening, and it was interesting to see you mention that in the book, because most of the time as writers, we just say like, oh, well, I'm not going to talk about that bad thing that happened, that when they didn't want to talk to me. But you also lay out some other missteps, I think, and that to me was really interesting.
Yeah. I think it's been funny having some friends and colleagues read the epilogue of the book, which is very much kind of my personal journey in reporting and finding the story. Because the ones who aren't journalists are like, I don't totally get this. And the ones who are journalists are like, wow, like I completely know that feeling. And I think it is important for us to talk about and to just have more like open conversations about when we push and when we don't, and how we kind of keep that credibility as storytellers while also acknowledging like this isn't my place. That's really important. And I just really quickly I want to say too, it's the American thing over there is both an advantage and a disadvantage. Like there's certain missteps I think you're permitted sometimes as an American in that space, probably unfairly so, that like Irish reporters and reporters from Northern Ireland probably aren't afforded that same grace. And that's, my hat is off to the people who do that work.
How did you, and this was something I struggled with when I wrote my book at first, was like, how do you go from daily reporting and saying, okay, I'm going to write a 1,500 word story, I'm going to write a 3,000, 5,000 word story, and then being like, oh, I need to write 90,000 words. How did you, when you were writing this, figure out how to sort of like break through that ceiling?
With a massive sigh of relief, truly. But it is like one of the best pieces of advice that I got was like, you're actually just writing 30, 1,500 word stories. I think a lot of writers get that advice of, there's a different kind of narrative arc you have to deal with in a book, but every chapter just needs to have a story. You need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you need to keep people turning the page. But the structuring, this too, certainly with your book, structuring historical nonfiction is quite tough, especially something that kind of, you have to figure out where you orient yourself in time and space a lot, especially with long-running conflicts with long tails.
And you have multiple geographies too, which is
like,
I thought was really interesting, and being like figuring out, okay, when do I go back to Ireland? When do I go back to the United States? And how do I keep moving between these two places?
Yeah, and like, how do you keep readers oriented is something that you never really think about as a daily news reporter. Like, you have a dateline, great, everyone knows where you are. But in this, you kind of, you have to constantly sort of be reminding people where they're at, place and time, who they're dealing with. And that's a very tough thing that, that's what editors exist for,
You touched on this earlier, and it was something that I wanted to talk about, is that so often we think of history, especially history books, as written about things that happened 100 years ago, 500 years ago, and even like 50 years ago still feels to us as this past. But I know, like living in an Irish neighborhood in Philadelphia, like there was a time where I was walking down an alley and there's a Sinn Féin sign. Like there's bars that have IRA memorabilia in the basement in my neighborhood. So for me, this conflict it's interesting thinking about it still as this living conflict, even though it's technically, resolved in some way, the violent part of the conflict. So how do you write about something that still has breadth and still has possible history to come?
Yeah, it's this kind of, it's a touchy thing to deal with, right? Because across the board in the North, no one wants violence anymore, except very small contingents who are very much outliers. So you do kind of, how do you both acknowledge this uneasy peace, but also without fueling the idea that there will be a return to violence, And that was a tough line to kind of walk. Like, how do you acknowledge that there are still a lot of division, a lot of inequality, a lot of, the walls are still up in Belfast, the curbs are still painted in Derry, and there are still areas that, I don't park in with a Southern Reg. And, I think that, you need to find a way to talk about that without necessarily reverting immediately to, okay, back to 1969, So how do you talk about that? And I don't know. It's a tough thing to wrestle. I think telling it through people. There's only one person in this book who's still alive, and she's both the character who wouldn't talk and the character who is still alive in Northern Ireland. And I think that you don't have to smack audiences over the head with that to show how alive this still is.
So I'll end with a question that probably doesn't have a good answer. And what do you see the future of a 32-county Ireland looking like?
Can I use the cop-out of I'm an American and it's not my decision?
I don't know.
I'll say this. I have been very surprised as there's been conversations about the book in the UK. A lot of the people who have interviewed me or talked about the book who are kind of my generation or a little younger are very keen to talk about this and are very keen to confront colonialism and what happened and how Northern Ireland got to where it was in 1969 and 1970 and what a united Ireland could look like. So I actually think there is a path forward there. I think there's a reconciliation issue in Northern Ireland. There has been, and but that at least in my experience through reporting this book, that lack of interest in reconciliation is an institutional issue and not a people issue. And I think that the people of Northern Ireland are some of the most resilient, incredible people I've ever met. And in my mind, if they're the future of the place, then it's going to do all right.
All right. Well, thanks for chatting with me.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you all. We're going to take some questions from the audience now.
Yes, if you have a question, just raise your hand. We will bring the mic to you. Alex has one up there. I have one down here. I'll start in the hardest spot to get to.
Well, I found this interesting because I was with my family in Northern Ireland 2 summers ago, and we took the Troubles tour in Belfast. And our Catholic guide, you get a Catholic guide and a Protestant guide, was from Philadelphia. And he said that he was born in Northern Ireland, moved with his family to Philadelphia, lived there for a number of years, and then moved back. And he also claimed he was not an IRA member, and but said that the British troops had come to his family house one day and I think arrested his brother. So it's interesting that there is that Philly connection.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there are a lot of people in Philadelphia with that story. And, the experience that this gentleman talked about, is so widely described in Northern Ireland. And he's right. That often happened to people who had absolutely zero connections to the IRA, And, there are a lot of people, who were certainly against British occupation but never picked up a gun, but were still treated by the British and Unionist forces as if they did. So those stories, and they were very formative stories for people, and they carry them with them, whatever side of the ocean they're on, for sure.
I'm just curious what public history in Northern Ireland looks like as far as reconciliation goes. Are they trying to bridge those gaps, or is it too modern of a history that museums aren't talking about it?
Did you say museums are talking about it, or?
Like, are museums talking?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of I've in my read of it, like a lot of the reconciliation work is happening on a very community-based level. There's a lot of groups in Derry and Belfast that kind of work within these communities through either ex-prisoners, ex-paramilitaries, and there are some. A lot of, I don't know that I'd say a lot, but there is certainly a publicly funded space for that. But at the same time, there's depending on what road you're on in Belfast or Derry, like the museum's going to say different things, and that's one of the tricky things. And there's actually a note in the book about this that, everything that you say, everything that you do, wherever you're from or say you're from up there, quietly indicates where your bias or your position on these things. And it's as much about what you say as what you don't say. That's like, there's a museum down the Falls Road called the Republican History Museum, which is an amazing resource for history. There is also a similar museum in East Belfast. So there are these kinds of like dueling versions of histories there. For as much as there is an effort to kind of bridge those gaps, you do kind of always have to be cognizant of what side of the road you're on, literally, and what you're hearing and what you're reading and understanding where that comes from.
Hey, I grew up Irish Catholic in Boston. My second generation. My parents grew up in Roxbury, Irish ghetto. And I was just thinking, it just jogged a memory. And I lived in Limerick, too, as a student working for a company over there, Northeastern University, co-op job, international. But just I had this memory when you were talking. I remember there was a big story in Boston. Boston Globe did a big expose because there was a murder in I think it was in Belfast, and they traced the gun back to a big theft at the National Guard Armory in Danvers, Massachusetts, north of Boston, not too far from where I live from. And it just came to mind as you were talking. And that was the first time it really hit home to me that there was this giant trade going on supplying guns to the Troubles. And then living in Ireland, living in Limerick and working over there, I saw it firsthand. Had a couple close calls with the IRA myself over there, driving around, delivering food to pubs, working my co-op job. And it was pretty scary. And I got stopped several times by the Army. And I never forget, I was in Ballyshannon, which was is a major bridge there into the north. And I was driving my truck looking for O'Malley's Pub. And I got stopped by the Army, and they said, where you be going, laddie? And I said, well, I'm going for the pub up above. And he says, you're from Limerick, right? He saw my license plates, and I said, yep. And then he let me go, but I was thinking, what's this guy going to do? Just a single, Irish Army. Until I looked over to my left, and there was a pillbox with a machine gun on me. This was 1978, late 70s, so I was there during the Troubles, had a couple close calls. And it was pretty scary, like cars going by with guys wearing masks. And I wound up driving from there to Pedigo to make a delivery. And I could have been kidnapped at any point. And people don't understand that. It's very personal, local crime, people fighting back and forth. Who's the enemy? It's very critical. But the connection between Danvers, Mass. and this Belfast killing was really chilling for me.
Yeah, and it's difficult to, it's those specifics that are still so difficult to grasp in the Troubles. It's like we kind of talk broadly, and that's, you mentioned about the gun in the book, and there's always this kind of broad understanding that America sent a lot of guns over to the North, right? But these specific instances are so difficult to grasp, and that there's actually this is crazy. I mean, of all the thousands of documents that I read for this thing, there's a small folder in the British Archives, which is outside London, kind of near Richmond, and there's this. It still blows my mind that this is literally all I could find after all this work. That there's like a 3-page document, almost like a hand-drawn Excel spreadsheet, that just has date of incident, location, description, where they think the gun came from. And, even those are kind of sparse on details. But when you think about, like, okay, that maybe told the story of, like, 20 guns, those 3 pages, like, first of all, where the hell are the rest of the pages, how do they not exist? As a reporter, it drives you crazy. But then you also realize there's probably reasons that these specifics are sort of void from the conversation. But it's those things that drive it home, right? Like, you still remember that Boston connection there. And, it does kind of force us to confront a lot more when we have to deal with those gritty details.
Yeah, hi. I grew up in Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia, which for folks who don't know is Protestant Central. It's blue blood Central. It's where William Penn's family, they told people where William Penn could park his boat. That's how long families were there. But I'm from a huge Irish Catholic family. So I went to Chestnut Hill Academy. I worked on the grounds crew with my brother to help pay the tuition. This is I forget what year. I wear a T-shirt to work one day that says IRA all the way. And on the back it had support Irish Northern Aid. I had no idea. I mean, I kind of knew.
I think we actually talk about your T-shirt in the book at one point.
Well, unfortunately,
probably not yours, but
of course, unfortunately, I was working. The headmaster was a guy named Barnaby Roberts. He was from England. It was the day after the IRA killed Lord Mountbatten. He was not amused. They didn't throw me out of the school, but anyway, my question is, how about the class divide? I mean, to me, you have the religious divide, and I've always wondered about the wealthy folks who are funding a lot of this activity on both. I grew up, it was always the wealthy, rich Protestants who were the problem. That's the way we were raised. But there were a lot of Catholic families who had a lot of money who were funding this as well, or no? I'm just wondering about the class divide between both sides, or is it just, that didn't matter?
Yeah, no way. It was, that was, now granted, the arc of Americans getting involved in the Irish struggle is long, 30 years long. But when I'm specifically talking about this moment in Nor Aid, what was so powerful to me about that story is that it was working class people. It's carpenters, it's union guys, it's people who actually don't have the money to spare to throw into these coffers, but they did because they felt so strongly about it. There's a great line, I think it's from an old Philly mag piece, actually, that they were just kind of describing the differences in the diasporas between Boston, New York, Philly. And they said, New York's Irish, I think they used what is now considered a slur, but they said New York's Irish had permeated kind of every level of society, and Boston's Irish, via the Kennedys, had kind of ascended to the political class, but Philly's Irish were still barmen, roofers, and stonemasons, and that was the heart and soul of Irish Northern Aid. And they actually, when they're describing this Philly diaspora, they said, it actually, once folks moved out to the main line, they kind of distanced themselves from Nor Aid. This was people in Northeast Philly, West Philly, these old school working class areas who still just felt really connected to that struggle. And frankly, that's what the divide is in the North too. We're not necessarily talking about people who, the landed gentry. These are working class neighborhoods in East Belfast and West Belfast,
There was one line that you had in the book about a certain dance, where it cost $100 to go. And I was like, that's so much money for a roofer or a longshoreman, especially back then, thinking about I'm going to do this on a Friday night with my family to support this. And that was to me, that was one of the things where it clicked, this is money that they don't have, that they're giving away.
And this is what they're choosing to support,
This is a question for my boyfriend who couldn't be here today, but he has done lots of research on the IRA as well. And he has a question for you. He said, How do you feel about Sinn Féin's political surge and the plan to add more Garda to the country as a whole?
And say that again.
How do you feel about Sinn Féin's political surge and the plan to add more Garda to the country as a whole?
I mean, well, again, I'm going to try kind of use the American thing to, you never want to commentate on, politics necessarily. It's not my place necessarily to say it. But it is interesting, as an American, I kind of had this impression of how Sinn Féin was seen in Ireland. And now having, spent a lot of time both in the North and the Republic, Sinn Féin does not necessarily have as much of a groundswell in the Republic. Obviously they did, probably better than expected in this last election, regardless of what some of the mainstream press might have said. But there are still real strongholds along the border and in the North where they have a lot of support. But they're in an interesting transitional moment too, and how do you, it's kind of it's a question that exists in any conflict like this of like, how do you kind of turn a guerrilla organization into a polished, legitimate political party while kind of recognizing your baggage, but also not totally recognizing your, and the question of reconciliation comes to Sinn Féin too, and they've obviously struggled to kind of figure out how to manage that. Your boyfriend will probably not be happy with that total answer to the question, but.
He's nodding his head.
Yeah, okay, all right, great.
Did you start the question? Any other? Oh, yep.
I know that for monarchists in the UK in general, Charles wasn't exactly a popular welcome change. But I was curious if you saw a difference in the conversation politically in Northern Ireland, shifting away from a monarch who had been active during the Troubles and who set the tone as the reigning leader into someone who didn't. So the change in the monarchy and just culturally, if that shifted at all.
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I don't know that I saw that on a ground level. That doesn't mean it wasn't there. I probably didn't have many conversations about Charles with people. It was the first weekend I was in Ireland when the Queen died. And I was actually staying in the house of Vince Conlon. And I wrote a note that day. I'm like, this is just too weird that after 2 years I'm in this living room the day that the Queen dies. It was strange. And we drove through all the counties the next day, or the border the next day, and some of the flags were at half staff. And immediately when you go into a town and the curbs are red, white, and blue, and the Union Jacks are flying. So that was an interesting tonal shift for sure. You could feel that viscerally. But I don't know. I mean, I think yeah, I mean, so I was trying to figure out how to say what I think about these questions, not claiming to have a right to them as an American, but I don't necessarily know that the monarchy is heralded among a younger generation in the North from either side as it might have been among older generations, regardless of who's there. But I can't necessarily speak for everybody on that. It's just kind of my read on it.
Hi. The IRA had leftist politics, links to all kinds of revolutionary groups, including anti-colonialist groups and Marxist groups across Europe. How did those links go the other way? Did those links affect the Irish Americans in Philadelphia, and did it change their politics at all?
Yeah, that's actually a pretty big theme in the book of, part of what I hope is kind of an overarching theme in this book is the difference sometimes between Irish American politics and Irish politics, which are very, very different. And there's a couple scenes in here, for example, when the Provisional IRA first started kind of sending representatives over to America, or even those who weren't necessarily IRA affiliated, Bernadette Devlin, for one, who was an MP from Tyrone, who certainly had full-throated support for a lot of these ideals. She kind of came over and rattled the cages of, supporting Black liberation issues, and it did not go well, to the point that she was, if I'm remembering the scene correctly, she was actually booed off a stage for supporting Black liberation issues in Philadelphia, I believe. It might have been Chicago. But that was kind of a heads up for a lot of IRA supporters in the States. And she left, and they said, listen, anybody who else comes over here, we literally just need money. Put your politics aside. So that's an interesting dynamic there, right? It's almost like the principles had to sort of be, they made the choice to deaden some of those principles to cultivate Irish American support, which was certainly much more moderate than a lot of these revolutionary ideals. And we see that divide we certainly see that divide persist today. But it's interesting to me that was very clear way back then, you know? The movement in the North in '69 that kicks all this off was a civil rights movement of Catholics, marching against Unionist one-party rule and oppression in the North. Much of it inspired by or connections between them and the American civil rights organizations. And among Irish America, those causes didn't necessarily have support. So there's definitely a real contrast there in principle. And I think that's described a lot in the book. You should buy it. You should read it.
I thought geopolitically it was interesting too, because you think about this happening in the 70s too. So you still think about the Cold War, and you think about, because you mentioned in the book at one point that there were some people who were like, oh, the people who are coming over are communists. Like the people from the provost who were coming over, they were viewed to some people, they're like, don't send them again.
Yeah,
like
totally.
don't send the people who are so leftist that it's not going to get us money.
Yeah, it almost became like a screening thing where they're just like, oh, no. If you're going to start like talking about civil rights over here, like it's not a good idea. So yeah, that dichotomy is really interesting.
Right back here.
Hi. Yeah. So you touched on this a little bit, but I was in Dublin in Easter of 2016. So it was a big year, lots of celebrations for the Easter Rising, things like that. Gerry Adams was speaking, lots of big Sinn Féin rallies and events there, and is sort of interesting to me because they emphasize a lot of continuity, not just to the 70s, but to 1916 and 1848 and 1798 and going back and things like that. So, but now, Gerry Adams isn't the leader anymore. Things have changed. I think most nationalist movements, even like the much less dangerous, like Scottish nationalists, still employ occasionally, subtly, but like the imagery of Robert the Bruce and things like that. How do you think about modern nationalists kind of negotiating this sense of continuity of the Irish nationalist movement, going from the I think fairly uncontroversial, like the Celtic woman will sing songs about the '98 Rising, but the closer you get to the present, the rawer it gets. How do you think this sort of like new generation of like Michelle O'Neill, Mary Lou McDonald, people who were not part of the Republican movement during the PRIRA's heyday, sort of negotiate that sort of shared historical story going back 200, 800 years?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the unanswered question now with the new generation of Sinn Féin, right? And there's been a couple great books written about, who is Mary Lou McDonald, who is Michelle O'Neill? Are they actually capable? Like, I guess the real question is, can the party, in severing its ties to the PIRA era, can the party still be itself without that? And I don't know that, I think that does kind of remain to be seen, right? Like Gerry Adams has reinvented himself as like the funny grandpa who tweets cat gifs. And like, how do we like confront, it kind of makes your head melt. And like, how do you buy into the party without acknowledging or at some level tacitly endorsing what it took to get you there? I don't have the answer to that question, but I think we're almost seeing Sinn Féin try to figure it out in real time. And I think it'd be fair to say they are probably like the main contemporary example of this, of like, can this work? Like, can you take a legalized rebel organization, kind of push out the bad stuff and reinvent it without necessarily dealing with some of that like problematic stuff before, and we're kind of seeing that happen in real time. And it's going to be, I think, a test case for a lot of other places.
Any other questions before we wrap up? No.
Just one further comment. Growing up in Boston, I remember the whole IRA thing was so romanticized. the fight. And then living in Limerick later and being on the street, and later realizing 3,000 people were killed. A lot of them were neighbors and friends, and it was so brutal. So it was not romantic.
Yeah, it was. I guess this is actually a good note to leave you on. First of all, it's been interesting. It was so important and also so interesting to do a lot of this work from Ireland. That was so important as a writer and to the book. And it was interesting because over there, the second I mentioned NORAID, everyone's like, oh yeah, they sent the guns. But you mentioned NORAID over here, and they're like, no, we didn't. Or sometimes we did, but not really. So there's a totally different read of that history from over there. And NORAID, I found, was actually much more colloquially known. I never had to explain what it was when I told people I was writing about NORAID over there. So I moved over there to get my master's in writing, and I told someone I met through that course that I was working on this book, and they're Irish. And I did a very brief elevator pitch, and they were like, "Oh yeah, you guys all love the raw over there, don't you?" And that's there is this kind of view from Ireland, which I think is probably correct a lot of the time, that we kind of come over there and walk into bars and try and shout up the raw, and they're like, it's a little more complicated than that over here, And so I guess if there's one thing I really hope the book does, it kind of makes Irish America think about that, and just kind of think about how much more complicated this history is, and force us and me as an Irish American to confront that a little more clearly.
Well, on that note, can we have a round of applause for Ali and Bradford?
Thank you all so much for coming.